Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space, where I take stories from across the internet and read it for your entertainment. This particular story is called Being Neighbourly and is written by Dr. Mantis Toboggan. Sunrise over the clear river was beautiful. The mountains framed the sun, the 3 moons aligned with the tallest of the summits of the range, and the clouds never got in the way. Young Drusk cock-a-doodled into the air, and people woke up, eager for their day's work. Varan got out of bed and helped his father feed their forge, made sure all the ingots were ready and accessible, cleaned all the tools of any dust, and opened the large doors at the end of the room to ensure good airflow. When the Varan noticed how quiet the town was, instead of the usual line of farmers asking for their plowshares and horseshoes to be mended or replaced, Varan was faced with an empty street. Curiosity pushed Varan to step further out of the forge, and he saw a group of villagers at the center of the town. He gained permission from his father to go see what was going on, and approached the small crowd, seeing it centered around a trio of Surus, tall reptilian people that were twice the size of regular folk. And at their feet was the mayor, dead. Which is why you should thank us. Clearly he was too weak to protect you from bandits and raiders, which is why we felt it was our duty to step in, one of the Surus was saying, his scales brighter and healthier compared to the other 2. This is the part where you thank us, said the tallest one, towering over the mayor's wife. The mayor's wife looked up, anger and fear visible to Varan, but she slowly choked out a "thank you" before she burst into tears. My, you don't seem to be that grateful. No smile, no song, no dance. My, maybe we ought to help you out, said the third, who sported a gold ring on his left index finger. Before anyone could reply, his hand flew to his belt and drew a knife, launching it from the kneeling folk's foot. She jumped back and surprised as the Surus laughed, and the other 2 joined in, throwing knives at her feet to make her move around, doing her best to avoid getting hit. The Surus laughed a horrible and cruel laugh until Varan heard a shout from behind them. Hey, eggheads! Varan turned around to see his father standing in the road, calmly walking towards the trio of Surus, carrying his crossbow. Why don't you 3 point out which one killed the mayor, and I will let the other 2 of you go. The Surus stopped their chortling and looked at each other. Bright Scale steps forward. Well, neighbour, that sounds like a threat. Are you threatening us? Varan's father nodded. I suppose I am. Well, for the threat to be legitimate, you have to be showing intent to harm. Why don't you make it official and point that boltcaster our way? Varan's father was confused but complied. I suppose I'll do, he spoke, his speech interrupted by a knife to the throat. Varan hadn't even seen the Suran's hand move. One moment it was near his hip, and the next it was extended towards Varan's father. The Sauri walked up to Varan. Young man, you just witnessed what just happened, didn't you? He asked, placing a hand on Varan's shoulders. Varan nodded, otherwise paralyzed by fear. You heard him threaten us and point his crossbow at me, didn't you? Varan nodded again. So we agree that it was self-defense. That wasn't a question. Varan nodded anyways. He'd always be ashamed of that final nod. Good! Now why don't we pick up that dagger of mine for me, like a good neighbor should? Shink, shink, shink. Sunrise over the clear river was beautiful. The mountains framed the sun, the 3 moons aligned with the tallest summits of the range. The only things getting in the way were the tall post to which Varan's neighbor was tied up. Varan had been forced to build that post, dig a hole for it, and supply the necessary rope. Well, he hadn't been forced. The Saris had asked him to do it as a neighborly favor. Varan knew what happened to those who weren't neighborly. Shink, 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 shink. Sunrise over the clear river was beautiful. The mountains framed the sun, the 3 moons aligned with the tallest summit of the range. The only thing getting in the way was the smoke from Rygel's house as it burned. He hadn't been neighborly when the Surus had asked for one of his courts. Shink, 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 Sunrise over the clear river was beautiful. The mountains framed the sun, the 3 moons aligned with the tallest summits of the range, and the clouds never got in the way. The people of Clear River had learned to be neighborly. Shink, 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 shink. Sunrise over Clear River was beautiful. The mountains were framed in the sun, the 3 moons aligned with the tallest of the range, and the clouds never got in the way. But the quiet of the lonely road into Clear River was disturbed by the steps of a newcomer. Shink, shink, shink. The door to the tavern creaked as the newcomer entered. He was tall as a Surrey, but had the skin and full-rounded face of a folk. He wasn't as muscular as an orc, but he was halfway there. His head was covered by a wide-brimmed straw hat and wore simple trousers, and on his back was a simple traveller's pack. His torso, however, was covered by some sort of quilt, tucked up around his neck and ended halfway down his thigh. The newcomer surveyed the tavern and saw that it was empty, save for the bartender and a Surrey with bright scales. The newcomer approached the bar, sat on a stool, and his hand emerged from a slit on the side of his covering with a trio of copper coins. The folk, happy to see payment, scurried over and asked what the newcomer wanted. "Something local." The folk nodded, and a minute later he placed a tankard in front of the newcomer. The Surrey observed the newcomer drink, and drunkenly got up, staggered over, and sat down next to him. "Well, howdy. You're new here, aren't you?" The newcomer said nothing. "Well, since you're a newcomer to Clear River, I just want you to tell you how things work around here. You see, we all try to be neighbor. Can I smoke you?" The newcomer asked the bartender, ignoring bright scales. The bartender just nodded and scurried into the storeroom, terrified of getting involved. "Now, interrupting isn't very neighborly," the Surrey said. The newcomer pulled out a pipe and gently jammed Sweetleaf into it. "Well, you are right. How can I expect a newcomer to know about our customs, such as our non-resident smoking tax?" The newcomer pulled out a tinderbox and lit the Sweetleaf, gently inhaling. Bright Scales ogled the tinderbox with obvious jealousy. "Now, that's a fine device, friend. Where did you get it?" The newcomer, for the first time, turned to Bright Scales. "Kill the taxman," he said, blowing smoke into the Surrey's face. Bright Scales was stunned for a moment, then laughed. "Well, friend, it sounds like you're a dangerous element, and we don't like dangerous elements in Clear River. So why don't you give the town a gift of friendship to show us you mean us no harm?" The newcomer reached out again and placed 3 more copper coins on the table. Bright Scales grinned and reached for them, only to find that the newcomer was gripping his wrist. "They're for the drink, not you." The newcomer let go, got up, went around the bar, and poured himself another drink. Bright Scales decided to reach for the coins again, when his hand bumped into something. He looked down and saw that it was a knife embedded in the bar top. It hadn't been there when the newcomer got up, and Bright Scales hadn't seen the newcomer throw it. Bright Scales had had enough. It was bad enough that his companions had left him here to watch the town while they went hunting, but now this arsehole was disrespecting him. "Well, it looks like you're determined not to be neighborly, so I think we should take this outside." "Why? Your fists don't work indoors?" the newcomer asked, not even looking up. The Surrey grew angrier, reached to his knife belt, and threw his dagger at the newcomer. The Surrey was too drunk to fully register what happened, but there was a loud crack, and the next thing Bright Scales knew was the dagger was clattering on the floor. The newcomer calmly walked over to the dagger, drink in hand, picked it up, and walked over to the Surrey. You dropped this," he said, jamming it into the table. He reached out with a silver coin and placed it on the bar top, and spoke loud enough for the terrified bartender to hear. "The silver's for the knife marks left tonight on this nice wood." The newcomer turned to Bright Scales, making eye contact. "Just being neighborly." The newcomer turned and made for the door, finishing his drink as he walked. He placed the tankard on the table nearest to the exit. Bright Scales simmered with rage, then leapt up after the newcomer. He followed him outside, pulled out his knife, and shouted at the newcomer, "Hey, arsehole!" The newcomer saw Bright Scales throw the knife. his aim unhindered by his inebriation. But once more there was a loud crack, and the dagger fell to the ground. Bright Scales, alongside the residents who were peering out of their windows, saw what made the noise. A whip lay on the ground, trailing from under the newcomer's covering. One time is an accident, second time is a coincidence, third time makes it serious, the newcomer said. He didn't shout, but his voice carried to all the observers. Bright Scales realized that the newcomer wasn't any traveler or wanderer. Bright Scales needed to do something to save face. Bright Scales suddenly had a fantastic idea. 2 knives. Bright Scales got into position, his hands poised to draw and throw, before the newcomer spoke again. Before we continue, you should go back and pay for your drinks. Bright Scales smirked. I don't pay for my drinks. You will. Before the newcomer could say anything else, Bright Scales reached into his belt and threw a dagger with each hand. Crack! As expected, the human had managed to knock one dagger out of the air. Bright Scales looked at where the second one ought to have hit, before he realized that the human had grabbed a hold of the second one. Then Bright Scales realized that there was a lump in his throat, not a metaphorical one from fear, but something tangible. He tried to reach for the knife in his throat. His hand never got that far. The newcomer walked over to the Sauri's corpse, retrieved his knife, collected Bright Scales' coin purse, and entered the bar. When he came out, he walked straight for Farron's home and knocked on the door of the forge. Farron slowly opened the door and saw a silver coin in the newcomer's outstretched hand. Prepare a pyre. Farron nodded, accepted the coin, and watched the newcomer leave. Be careful, his friends will come after you, Farron shouted after the newcomer. The newcomer stopped. How many more? 2 others. Farron jumped at the sound of 2 more silver coins landing by his feet, and watched in awe as the newcomer walked away from Clear River. And Farron knew, no matter what happened, that he'd remember for the rest of his life the noise the newcomer made with each step. Shink, 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 shink. End of story. Being Neighbourly, Part 2. Sunrise over Clear River was beautiful. The mountains framed the sun, the 3 moons aligned with the tallest summits of the range. The only thing getting in the way was the smoke of the Bright Scales funeral pyre as it burned. The 2 other Suris were not as enraged as Farron had feared, as they seemed genuinely thankful for the pyre. Apparently in Suri culture, when a warrior died, his body was burned and the ashes were used as war paint for the next hunt. Baran had no idea if the stranger who had killed Bright Scales knew about this when he commissioned the pyre. Baran didn't want to tell the 2 remaining Suris that Farron had been commissioned to make pyres for them as well. Worst case scenario, he was up 2 silvers. Best case scenario, Clear River would be free from the Suris. When? The Suris watched the flames diminish over the day, mourning their fallen comrade. They spent almost an hour finger-painting each other with taunting in their hissing and howling language. And when they were done, they attached themselves with their knife belts and, in the shorter one's case, his golden ring. The Sauris slowly strode out of Clear River and began stalking into the nearby forest. Goldringer went north, towards the mountains, while the taller one went south, following the direction of the only road out of town, which the stranger had last been seen walking down. Halsey was enraged. He and his brother had only left town for a couple of hours, and some arsehole had gone and killed his other brother. At least the arsehole had honor. That, as his one saving grace, he paid for the funeral pyre, and in return, Halsey would make this guy's death quick and painless. Halsey followed the road for quite some time until he finally spotted a trail leading eastwards, towards the river that the town took its name from. Staying low, Halsey followed the tracks, making sure to stay as aware as possible as he could of his surroundings. Sure, he had occupied the step on the societal ladder above bully, but below roaming brigand. but he and his brothers had once been a Den tribe's greatest hunters. Halsey felt smug as he spotted the first trap, a simple snare barely camouflaged against the underbrush. Halsey stepped over it and continued onwards. 2 more traps in a straight line, almost as if Halsey's prey knew that he was coming. Halsey suppressed a scoff. Any experienced hunter would have put them in spots with more animal traffic. Halsey stalked the stranger's trail and eventually reached the edge of the forest, where the trees stopped for about 10 meters, and then the ground sloped downwards for 2 meters to meet the river. And right beside the river, he spotted the stranger's tent. And right there, right outside the tent, was the stranger, sleeping, laying down on a sloping riverbank, hat angled in front of his head to protect his face from the sun. Unfortunately for him, it also prevented him from seeing anyone at a higher elevation. Halsey approached the top of the slope. Silently, he pulled a knife from his belt and held it high, gave a silent prayer to his brother that he'd been avenging and a silent gloat to his brother that he'd be beating. And then he dropped the knife as he felt immense pain as something stabbed him in the back. Halsey jumped to the side, just in time to avoid a second thrown knife. He looked behind him to see, perched on top of the trees, dressed in only his breeches and his knife belt, was the stranger. Halsey cursed himself as he roared and charged the tree, dodging the knives the stranger was throwing down at him, and began climbing up, leaping branch to branch. Thankfully, his height gave him the greater reach. He was a meter below the stranger and pulled out his knife to try and stab his brother's killer when his adversary did something unexpected. He jumped. It was at least a 10-meter fall, but only once the stranger had jumped did Halsey spot the rope in the stranger's hand, and watched as the mid-leap the stranger turned and threw the rope, tied into a 1-knot noose, to grab onto a solid tree branch and managed to land safely. Halsey scrambled to drop down quickly to not let his quarry escape, but the stranger had other plans. He approached the base of the tree's trunk, in which there were 3 small holes that Halsey hadn't noticed in his fury. The stranger retrieved 2 pieces of flint from a pouch on his belt knife and smashed them together, shaving sparks down on a small hole and creating a muffled bang inside the tree. Halsey heard the first noise, recognizing it as blasting powder. He felt the second shake of the tree. After the third, the tree began to sway westwards towards the road. Halsey rushed to climb down safely, but he was barely halfway down when the tree, when it was toppling, was blocked by the adjacent tree, causing him to be launched straight towards the hard ground. He couldn't tell if it was moments or hours, but Halsey regained consciousness and sat up. He was hurting. His left wrist wasn't working right, and his head pounded, but at least he was alive. He stood up and looked for the stranger, spotting him at the top of the riverbank's slope. The stranger just stood there, hands above his knife belt, and the warning very clear: walk away, or else. Halsey knew that he would lose a knife-throwing fight against the stranger now that his throwing hand was out of commission. That left only one option. Halsey rushed forward, putting his hands up to provide cover for his head and body. Keeping low to the ground as his tall frame would allow, he charged the stranger as fast as he could. The stranger just stood there, nowhere to run, and flung knife after knife towards Halsey, who either dodged them or let his forearms take the hit. And when he finally reached the stranger, Halsey grabbed him by the waist and pushed him both over the riverbank, rolling and tumbling to the water. Halsey felt the stranger stab him once on the side, but the Suri was too enraged to care, and instead focused on grappling with the stranger and keeping him under the water. Sauris were apex predators in the swamps and marshes, and could hold their breath for up to an hour. He doubted that the stranger could do the same, given that he was, by Halsey's estimation, just a taller halfling. Halsey managed to get around behind the stranger, looping his powerful arms around the stranger's armpits and clasping his fingers together behind the stranger's back. This tail sneaked out through his legs and curled around the strangers, forcing them together. Finally, Halsey just laid back, his nostrils closing themselves to not let any water in, while the strangers began streaming precious air towards the river's surface. Halsey reveled in his inevitable victory, momentarily distracted from the stranger's arms. After all, what could he do without his knives? Stick his fingers in Halsey's eyes, apparently. Halsey roared in pain, the sound muffled and distorted by the water, and the stranger pushed his fingers deeper into Halsey's eye sockets, grasping his whole right eye, and pulled. Halsey let go of the stranger as he saw the stranger let go of his eye and release it to be carried off in the river's current. The stranger took advantage of this and began wading over to where he'd set up camp, gaining a head start while Halsey recovered from his latest injury. The Suri stood up and roared, a sound that made nearby birds flee from their perches as he followed the stranger, his longer strides allowing him to catch up and tackle the stranger, knocking him onto his front, his head barely entering the tent. Halsey flipped him over and punched him in the face. The stranger raised his left hand to block the next one. Halsey gave him a left hook to the ribs, feeling something crack. The stranger reached out with his right hand, trying to reach a bag inside the tent. Halsey grabbed his left wrist and twisted it out of the way and punched him in the mouth again. The stranger spat out a tooth and found what he was searching for. Halsey punched him in the eye, then stopped in shock as he felt the stranger hit him in the face. It didn't hurt, but he felt the impact, felt something push against the closed, empty eye socket. Until his eyelid gave away, he looked down at the human. The human just grinned an ugly grin, bloody and missing a tooth, and reached forward with a tinderbox. Click. Whoosh. Halsey heard something making unfamiliar sounds. He identified it as a rope trailing from his eye socket. The end was alight, and the fire trailing up unnaturally quick. He realized what was inside his eye socket and panicked, but before he could do anything, the stranger lifted up his legs. He put his soles on Halsey's chest and pushed. Halsey fell backwards and spotted the stranger running over him and away down the riverbank. As Halsey tried his best to gouge the blasting powder-filled bag out of his eye socket before the fuse reached the end. Bang! Once the blood and gore had finished flying through the sky, the stranger went back to his tent. He rummaged through his packs and found a healing potion, downing it. Once he caught his breath, he put on his tunic, his trousers, and his boots and torso covering, retrieved all of the knives that he'd thrown, and put on his hat, adjusting it to the right angle. He began walking back to Clear River, each step accompanied by the sound of knives clinking against each other. Shink, 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 shink. End of part 2. Being Neighbourly, part 3 of 3. Morning over Clear River was beautiful. The mountains shone in the light of the sun, the 3 moons only barely askew from being aligned with the tallest summits of the range, and the village stood silent in its appreciation of the natural beauty around it. That, and in fear that they held for the Sauri kneeling in the village square, they'd all heard the explosion coming from the woods earlier this morning, in the direction where the Sauri's taller brother had gone searching for their prey. They all assumed that the brother was dead, for the time had passed since the explosion than it would have taken for the Sauri to return. The remaining Sauri heard it as well. He didn't mourn or rage, but rather went to the center of the village square, took off his knife belt, and took a few minutes to place his knives into the dirt all around him, after which he knelt and waited. Then, in the silence, they heard it. Shink, 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 shink. All eyes in the village turned to the newcomer as he approached the Sauri, his smoking pipe in mouth, each step accompanied by the jangle of knives tapping against each other, his torso and arms hidden by the covering he wore around his neck. The Sauri looked up from where he was kneeling, naked, but for his loincloth and his golden ring, making eye contact with the newcomer. "Don't suppose there's any way that we both walk away from this?" the newcomer asked, taking a puff of his pipe and stepping closer towards the Sauri, entering the field of discarded knives. The Sauri slowly shook his head, unblinking. The newcomer undid the button, keeping his covering, and let it slide to the ground, revealing a bandolier of knives covering his chest and back, a pouch and a tinderbox on his left hip, and his whip on his right. He took off his hat and deposited it on his discarded covering alongside his pipe. The Sauri then grinned and raised a hand, pushing all the magic he'd been holding in his body from his meditation into the gold ring that he wore, causing blue runes to shine briefly. The same rune shone on the handled knives embedded in the ground behind the newcomer, at which point it floated out of the ground and began to fly towards the Sauri. Its path ended prematurely as it pierced the newcomer in the back. The newcomer struggled to not yelp in pain as he removed the knife, tracking the Sauri's movements. The Sauri rushed forward to uppercut the newcomer, but the newcomer dodged at the last second. The Sauri took the advantage by the repositioning to activate his ring again, causing another knife to fly towards the newcomer from behind. This time the newcomer was ready and sidestepped as soon as he saw the ring's glow. Then, before the Sauri could react, he stepped forward and blew smoke from his last pipe puff into the Sauri's face. The Sauri coughed and spluttered as the smoke entered his mouth and coated his wet eyes, and began swinging wildly as he desperately licked his eyeballs clean. The newcomer took one much-needed breath of fresh air and stepped out of the Sauri's reach. Then he drew knives and began launching them at the Sauri. To his dismay, the knife was stopped by the shimmering green barrier that appeared on the Sauri's skin right before impact. He tried 2 more knives, but both had the same effect. He did notice, however, that every time the barrier appeared, the green rune on the ring would flash. The Sauri grinned as his forked tongue cleared the last of the foreign materials from his eyes. He activated his ring once more, but the newcomer had been waiting for that, and he flung his knife at the Sauri as soon as the blue rune flashed, thinking that the Sauri couldn't run 2 enchantments active at the same time, as he didn't appear to be a mage. The newcomer sidestepped, narrowly dodging the knife that would have pierced him from behind had he been any slower, but to his surprise to see the latest projectile once more had no effect.
You probably thought that since I'm not a mage, I couldn't have 2 enchantments active at the same time, right?
The Sauri snarled.
You underestimate me as much as the mage I took this from. Surrender, and I will make it quick.
The newcomer said nothing, flinging 2 more knives at the Sauri, realizing what he had to do. The Sauri was not a mage, and he wasn't consciously controlling the shield enchantment on his ring. And since he didn't have anywhere to store as a source of mana on his person other than his loincloth, and didn't know how to properly collect mana from his surroundings, it meant that he was fueling the magic with his own body energy, an energy that could be depleted. So the newcomer set his plan in motion, dodging knives and coming from behind, while launching his own at the Sauri. For many long minutes he moved and dodged, receiving some scrapes and cuts for his efforts, but always on the edge of being stabbed in the back again. Then he ran out of knives. In his defense, the newcomer had never before faced foes that couldn't be dispatched by more than a dozen blades, and counting knives would be difficult to do while dodging knives coming at you from behind. But none of this mattered. He didn't need knives. He reached for the whip on his hip. With a loud crack, he snapped the tip of the whip into the Sauri's shielding, once more doing no damage. The second attack with the whip missed, landing the coiled rope by the Sauri's feet. Almost on instinct, the newcomer flicked it to coil around the Sauri's leg, and saw that it was held a few centimeters away from the Sauri's skin by the shielding. But it wasn't deflected. The newcomer gave the whip handle a tug and was delighted to see the Sauri's leg pulled with it, although the shimmering barrier around his leg held strong. The Sauri tripped and fell awkwardly to one knee, and the newcomer took advantage of the lull in the Sauri's attacks to kick him in the chin. Once more the shielding activated, but the Sauri's head moved backwards from the momentum, not as much as if his kick had connected, but enough that the newcomer realized that while the shield prevented the Sauri's body from being attacked, it didn't completely absorb the force of his attacks. And just like that, the mystique of the shielding evaporated, the newcomer realizing that it was nothing more than a weightless armor that would disappear if the wearer got tired enough. And the newcomer had fought armored foes aplenty. The newcomer leapt to the side as the Sauri called forth another knife, laying on the ground, and spun as he did so, using his momentum to launch a particularly vicious strike with his whip into the enchantment, then dodged forward and attempted to headbutt the Sauri. Oddly enough, his forehead didn't hurt from the effort. The closest sensation he could describe would be if a portion of his forehead had touched the enchantment encountered a wound strong enough to immediately reverse its course. But that's when the newcomer heard a sound that heralded his victory. The Sauri gasped for breath. He was getting tired. In his hubris, the newcomer didn't see that the Sauri moved his right hand, and one wearing the ring behind his body, preventing the newcomer from noticing when the rune was activated. And for the second time that day, the newcomer was knifed in the back, this time in the spot too difficult for him to reach. The newcomer grunted in pain and fell to one knee. The Sauri grinned and stepped forward, calling a knife to fly into his grip, ready to stab the newcomer in the back of the neck. But before the knife's trajectory could complete, he felt his feet get pulled forward, and as he fell onto his back, he saw that the newcomer held in each hand the ends of his whip, and rest of it the length had been used to trip the Sauri. The newcomer forced himself past his pain and leapt on top of the Sauri, reaching into a bag on his left hip, and produced a head of a noose, and fitted it over the Sauri's head. The Sauri attempted to get up, but the newcomer, still on top of the Sauri, elbowed him in the face, causing a black of his head to smash the ground below. Whomever made the Sauri's enchantment ring was smart enough to realize that spending energy to protect its wearer from the ground was a waste of mana. The newcomer scrambled to his feet and began running, pulling the noose out of the bottomless bag as he did so, ensuring the rope was never more or less than one tug away from becoming taut. The Sauri got up just in time to see the newcomer leave the field of knives and grin as he gave the noose a pull. The Sauri was lulled forwards and smashed face first into the ground and struggled as he was pulled towards the newcomer.
"You're not accomplishing anything, you idiot. I can still breathe,"
the Sauri shouted, recalling a knife and beginning to cut through the noose. The newcomer said nothing as he pulled, and as soon as the Sauri had cut himself free, he rushed forward, and with another crack, used his whip to send the Sauri's knife flying. The newcomer took more rope out of the bottomless bag and kicked the Sauri's head into the ground once more, buying himself enough time to kneel on top of the Sauri's back and use his rope to tie the Sauri's arms together, the tightness of the rope causing the shielding enchantment to strain, its green hue becoming brighter. The newcomer knew the fight was over. There were no knives between him and the Sauri, who was now in no position to fight. All he had to do was tire out the Sauri, then land the killing blow. The newcomer raised the whip to begin pelting the Sauri, when the ring flashed blue, brighter than ever before. The newcomer realized almost too late that if the ring could recall one knife at a time, it could likely recall all knives at once. He quickly dove out of the way, and the flood of steel coming his way, but not fast enough to avoid two embedding themselves in his leg. The Sauri laughed as the magical shielding disappeared, the mass recoil of knives making him too tired to continue feeding the ring the mana it needed. He slowly got up to his knees, then to his feet, and began to walk over to the newcomer.
"Well, looks like I eat whatever you are tonight,"
the Sauri said, panting between breaths. He grabbed a knife from the ground and slowly staggered to the newcomer. He was prone on the ground, bleeding from his leg where he'd been hit by the flying wave of knives. He was about to land the final blow when he roared in pain as he felt something hit him in the back. He turned around and saw the former blacksmith's son with the middle of the village square, his father's crossbow in his hands. "That's not neighborly," the Sauri said, flinging his knife towards the folk. He didn't have the experience or the reflexes necessary to dodge out of the way. The Sauri chided himself for his bad aim, as it only hit the folk in the shoulder instead of the neck. The folk struggled to reload his weapon, his shoulder robbed of its full strength and mobility. The Sauri debated whether he should take care of the folk first, but he was too tired to make the trip there and back, and ultimately decided to take care of the newcomer first. He turned back to the downed combatant and bent over to pull out the 2 knives embedded in the newcomer's leg, only to find them missing. Had he been less tired, he might have realized the only reason for their disappearance. The newcomer sat up from his prone position and stabbed the Sauri in the thigh. Then he reached up and stabbed him in the shoulder, using the leverage from the blades to pull him down onto the ground. The Sauri did his best to push the newcomer away, but the newcomer was stabbing and screaming and slowly, surely climbed on top of the Sauri. The newcomer then made to bring his knife down on the Sauri's neck to finish this once and for all. The Sauri knew that he was too weak and tired to grasp the newcomer's wrist. He did the only thing he could. He put his palm between his throat and the knife and pushed away from his throat with all of his might, while the newcomer pushed downwards as hard as he could. The Sauri could feel some of his energy returning, his species healing factor beginning to kick in, and he began to raise the knife higher and higher. The newcomer saw this, and with one grunt of desperation, he headbutted the knife, pushing it down mere centimeters. Then he headbutted it again, and again, and again. The newcomer didn't realize that the Sauri was limp until the 6th headbutt. He breathed out a sigh of relief and exhaustion. Then he reached into his bottomless bag to retrieve a red vial of healing potion, downing it half and pouring the rest on his many wounds. The newcomer lay on his back, oblivious to the cheers of the townspeople, ignoring the questions from the town healer asking if he was all right. Minutes later, he stood up, his leg capable of movement once more, and slowly walked to where he dropped his pipe, his hat, and his torso covering. He packed it with sweet leaf, lit it, and allowed himself a few puffs to celebrate. The newcomer spent the next 20 minutes slowly meandering about the town square, picking up his and the Sauri's knives, thanking any who helped with a simple nod, then made his way to the Sauri's body, cut off his finger, and removed the ring by the shortest path off the dismembered digit, pocketing it for later. Then, without a word, he began walking down the road. The townsfolk tried to get him to stop, to stay the night, to drink and feast with them. But the newcomer simply shook his head as he made his way back to his camp on the banks of the river. After an hour of slowly packing his camp, the newcomer tipped his hat and wordlessly began walking down the road away from Clear River. Shink, 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 shink. End of story. I would quickly like to thank our Tier 5 patrons, Dragzoon WRE, Quantum Wednesday, Ambrose Cattell, Lord Ashrakal, Bushmaster 177, Casper Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, and Arcadian. Thank you very much.